Imagine walking into the most beautiful palace on earth, golden walls glowing in candlelight, crystal chandeliers shimmering like frozen fireworks, mirrors reflecting endless sunlight, gardens so perfect they look almost unreal. Now imagine, it smells, not just a little, but enough to make you pause. Versailles, the symbol of absolute power, elegance, and refinement, was in ways most of us never picture shockingly unpleasant behind the shine. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Before we step through those gilded doors together, take a second to settle in. If you enjoy slow, immersive history told like a story whispered at night, this is your place. You can tap that subscribe button, leave a like if this journey pulls you in, or tell me where you're listening from. I always love imagining these stories traveling across different time zones and quiet bedrooms around the world. Now, soften the lights. Let the room grow calm. And let's walk into Versailles. In 1682, King Louis XIV of France made a bold decision. He moved the royal court from Paris to Versailles, a former hunting lodge surrounded by marshland. It was not just a change of address. It was a political masterstroke. As a child, Louis had lived through the Fronde, a series of civil uprisings between 1648 and 1653. Nobles had rebelled. Paris had become dangerous. The young king never forgot that fear, so he built something extraordinary. Versailles was not designed simply to be beautiful. It was designed to control. By moving the nobility away from their regional power bases and into one central palace, Louis could keep them close enough to observe, to influence, to exhaust. Versailles became a golden cage, and what a cage it was. The Hall of Mirrors alone contained 357 mirrors at a time when mirrors were rare and wildly expensive. France had intentionally broken Venice's monopoly on mirror production to achieve this. That is how serious they were about spectacle. The gardens covered nearly 2,000 acres. Fountains shot water into the air in elaborate choreography. Trees were arranged with mathematical precision. Nature itself was reshaped to reflect royal authority. Everything whispered the same message: power, permanence, perfection. If you were a visiting ambassador from England or Spain or the Holy Roman Empire, Versailles was meant to overwhelm you, to make you feel small. And it worked. Contemporary visitors wrote about the palace in awe. Some compared it to mythological realms. Others described it as a new center of civilization. But here is the quiet detail that often gets lost. Versailles was not built for comfort. It was built for performance. At its peak, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people could be present in the palace complex on a given day. Not just royals and nobles, but servants, guards, musicians, cooks, petitioners, craftsmen. Think about that for a moment. Imagine a small town. Now compress that town into a palace that had not originally been designed to handle that kind of human density. The architecture expanded over decades, but it was never truly planned as a modern residential complex. It grew in stages like a living organism. Rooms were added, wings extended, corridors lengthened, and through it all, the goal remained the same: keep the king at the center of everything. Even daily life revolved around ritual. Each morning, the king's awakening was a ceremony. Nobles gathered to watch him rise, dress, and begin his day. Only those of highest rank could hand him certain items of clothing. Access to the king was currency. If you wanted political influence, you did not lobby with speeches. You competed for the honor of holding a candlestick. It sounds almost theatrical, and in many ways it was. But living inside constant theater is exhausting. There was little privacy. Doors were thin. Walls echoed. People shared tight quarters depending on rank. Some courtiers slept in small rooms tucked into awkward corners of the palace just for the privilege of proximity. Status mattered more than space, and here is where we begin to see the contrast. From the outside, Versailles looked like heaven on earth. From the inside, it functioned more like a crowded performance hall that never closed. And when thousands of human beings live closely together, eating, sleeping, whispering, competing, the reality beneath the gold begins to surface. We tend to imagine royalty floating above ordinary human problems. But they still breathed the same air. They still aged. They still got tired. They still had bodies. In fact, one of the most surprising truths about Versailles is how ordinary many aspects of daily life were beneath the extraordinary decoration. The floors could be cold. Winters were harsh. Fireplaces did not evenly heat the enormous rooms. Drafts slipped through window frames. The palace glittered, but it was not always comfortable, and that discomfort did not contradict its magnificence. It revealed something deeper. Versailles was an illusion carefully maintained. It projected perfection while quietly managing inconvenience. It radiated control while constantly negotiating chaos behind the scenes. And perhaps that is why it feels so familiar. Even today, we polish the visible parts of our lives. We stage our best angles. We curate what others see. Versailles simply did it on a scale large enough to reshape Europe. For more than a century, this palace set the standard for fashion, etiquette, architecture, and monarchy across the continent. Courts from Russia to Spain copied its style. It became the blueprint for power expressed through beauty. But beauty, as we are about to discover, does not erase reality. In fact, sometimes it hides it. And as we step deeper into this palace, beyond the mirrors, beyond the gardens, beyond the candlelight, we begin to notice what the shine was covering. Because behind every golden facade, there is the everyday truth of human life. And in Versailles, that truth was far less polished than you might imagine. Let's move a little closer. Now, let us move past the mirrors, past the chandeliers, past the carefully choreographed fountains. Because once you step away from the spectacle and into the hallways where life actually happened, Versailles becomes something very different. Let me ask you something gently. Have you ever been at a packed concert or a football game where the restroom line felt longer than the event itself? Now imagine that situation. Remove modern plumbing, add silk stockings, and multiply it by several thousand people. At its height in the late 17th and 18th centuries, Versailles could host between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals on any given day. Nobles lived there for months at a time. Servants outnumbered aristocrats. Visitors flowed in, constantly hoping to catch a glimpse of power. But here is the detail that often surprises people the most. Versailles did not have a proper modern sewage system. Indoor plumbing, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There were some designated latrines. There were portable chamber pots. There were wooden commodes in certain apartments, but not nearly enough. In the early years, especially, many parts of the palace had no fixed toilets at all. According to court memoirs, including those of the Duc de Saint-Simon, people sometimes relieved themselves in stairwells behind tapestries or in quiet corners when necessity overpowered etiquette. Even the gardens were not spared. Yes, the same gardens designed by André Le Nôtre, with mathematical elegance and symbolic order. Imagine strolling through geometric hedges and suddenly realizing that the scent is not entirely floral. Servants were tasked with emptying chamber pots daily. But with thousands of occupants, waste accumulated quickly. Human waste, food scraps, animal droppings from horses and carriage traffic. And remember, garbage collection was not systematic in the way we expect today. Now here is something important. Versailles was not uniquely disgusting for its era. Paris itself struggled with sanitation. In London, waste was commonly dumped into the Thames well into the 18th century. It was only in the 19th century, after events like the Great Stink of 1858, that large-scale sewer reforms took place. The difference with Versailles was scale and symbolism. When ordinary cities smelled, it was unfortunate. When the most magnificent palace in Europe smelled, it was ironic. And irony has a way of lingering. There is also the question of privacy. Or rather, the lack of it. The king's daily life was ritualized in front of witnesses. But even beyond the royal chamber, space was limited. Courtiers often shared cramped rooms depending on rank. Some slept in converted closets or attic-like spaces simply to maintain proximity to influence. Would you give up comfort for status? Many did. Being physically present at Versailles meant access to opportunity, a chance for favor, a chance for advancement. But that meant living in close quarters. And close quarters amplify everything. Smells, sounds, illness, gossip. Think about how easily a cold spreads in an office building today. Now remove hand sanitizer, antibiotics, and modern ventilation. The palace windows were large, yes, but airflow was inconsistent. Fireplaces heated certain rooms unevenly. In winter, corridors could be freezing while inner chambers were stuffy. And still people stayed, because Versailles was not about comfort. It was about proximity to power. There is a strangely human tension here. We imagine royalty floating above inconvenience. Yet even nobles had to navigate the basic realities of bodily needs in a building that prioritized spectacle over sanitation. One historian once described Versailles as a place where elegance and inconvenience coexisted constantly. That feels accurate. Gold on the walls, drafts under the doors, perfume in the air, and somewhere nearby, a chamber pot waiting to be emptied. It almost sounds comedic. And in some ways, it was. Visitors sometimes wrote with subtle humor about the contradictions of court life. But beneath the humor is something revealing. Versailles shows us how much of civilization depends on infrastructure we barely think about. Sewers, waste management, water systems. These are not glamorous topics. They do not appear in paintings. Yet without them, even the grandest palace becomes vulnerable. Have you ever noticed how rarely movies show the practical side of historical life? No one lines up for the restroom in costume dramas. But in real life, they absolutely did. And perhaps that is why this part of the story feels so grounding. It strips away the fantasy just enough to reveal humanity. Because once you remove the illusion of flawless luxury, you begin to see the palace as a living organism. Thousands of breathing, sweating, laughing, competing human beings contained within walls of marble. And when humans gather in large numbers, reality cannot be perfumed away forever. Which brings us to something even more surprising. If sanitation was complicated, hygiene was guided by beliefs that might shock us today. Not because people were careless, but because they understood health very differently. And once we explore how they thought about bathing, scent, and cleanliness, Versailles becomes even more fascinating. Let us step a little closer into that world. And this is where the story becomes even more surprising. Because if sanitation at Versailles feels uncomfortable to imagine, the way people thought about personal hygiene might surprise you even more. Let me ask you something simple. How many showers have you taken this week? For most of us in America or Europe, bathing is automatic. Daily, sometimes twice a day. It feels like common sense. But in 17th century France, frequent bathing was not considered healthy. In fact, many doctors warned against it. At the time, European medicine was still shaped by the theory of the four humors. Illness was believed to come from imbalances inside the body. There was also a strong fear of what they called miasma, or bad air. Water, especially hot water, was thought to open the pores and allow disease to enter. So instead of soaking in bathtubs, people focused on what they believed was safer, changing linen frequently and wiping the skin with cloth. Louis XIV himself reportedly took very few full baths in his lifetime. Some accounts say only a handful. What he did do was change his shirt daily. And in that period, clean linen symbolized cleanliness more than soap and water did. Does that change the way you picture him? The Sun King wrapped in gold and velvet, avoiding long baths because doctors advised caution. It sounds strange to us, but within their understanding of science, it made sense. Perfume became essential. France especially, the town of Grasse, developed into the perfume capital of Europe. Scented gloves were fashionable. Powdered wigs were heavily perfumed. Pomanders filled with aromatic herbs were carried to mask unpleasant smells. Imagine walking into a ballroom at Versailles. Instead of fresh air, you are surrounded by layers of scent. Rose, amber, musk, orange blossom. Incense drifting upward from burners. It must have been overwhelming. And then there were the wigs. Those towering white wigs we associate with aristocracy were not simply fashion statements. They were status symbols. But they were also practical in a strange way. Shaving one's head could help manage lice, which were common across all social classes. A wig could be cleaned more easily than natural hair, or at least that was the theory. In reality, wigs could also become breeding grounds if not properly maintained. So they were dusted with powder, often made from starch. That powder sometimes fell onto shoulders like snow. Can you imagine attending a royal dinner while powdered wig dust gently floats into your soup? It sounds almost comedic. And yet this was normal life. Cosmetics were another story. Pale skin was desirable. It signaled wealth and indoor life. To achieve that pale complexion, some nobles used products containing lead. Yes, actual lead. Over time, this could cause skin damage, hair loss, and serious health issues. Beauty standards came at a cost. But again, this was not stupidity. It was limited knowledge. Germ theory would not be widely accepted until the 19th century, with scientists like Louis Pasteur demonstrating that microorganisms caused disease. During the reign of Louis XIV and Louis XV, bacteria were invisible, unknown, unimaginable. People feared bad smells because they believed bad smells caused illness. Ironically, sometimes they were not entirely wrong. Poor sanitation did contribute to disease. They just misunderstood the mechanism. Instead of eliminating germs, they masked odor. Instead of disinfecting surfaces, they burned incense. And yet, despite these limitations, court life continued to sparkle. There is something deeply human about that. Have you ever tried to solve a problem with the knowledge you had at the time, only to realize later that you were missing key information? That was Versailles, doing its best with incomplete science. Nobles prided themselves on refinement. Etiquette manuals detailed how to stand, how to bow, how to speak. But none of those manuals explained microbes, so people relied on routine. Fresh linen, powdered wigs, heavy perfume, and confidence. In some ways, confidence was half the illusion. If everyone believes that this is what cleanliness looks like, then it becomes the standard. It is easy for us to laugh gently at the idea of avoiding baths. But centuries from now, people might look back at our own habits and shake their heads. History has a way of humbling every generation. What fascinates me most is this contrast. On one hand, Versailles led Europe in art, architecture, fashion, diplomacy. It shaped culture for generations. On the other hand, its understanding of the human body was still bound to medieval ideas, brilliance and limitation existing side by side. And while perfume and powder could maintain appearances, they could not stop something far more powerful. Because no matter how refined the court became, disease still found its way through silk curtains and gilded doors. And that is where our story moves next. From scent to sickness, from illusion to vulnerability. Let us step carefully into that chapter. Now the air grows heavier, not with perfume this time, but with something far more powerful and far more invisible. Because no matter how brilliant the chandeliers, no matter how carefully powdered the wigs, no matter how often the linen was changed, Versailles could not escape one simple truth. Microbes do not respect crowns. In the 17th and 18th centuries, disease was a constant companion across Europe. But what makes Versailles so striking is that even the most powerful people in the country were just as vulnerable as everyone else. Take smallpox. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the time. It killed an estimated 400,000 Europeans every year during the 18th century. Survivors were often left with deep facial scars. Some lost their eyesight. It did not matter if you were a farmer or a king. In 1774, King Louis XV of France contracted smallpox. This was not a distant relative. This was the sitting monarch of France living in the most extravagant palace in Europe. According to contemporary accounts, the disease progressed quickly. His body weakened. The court watched anxiously. Physicians could offer little more than traditional treatments rooted in humoral theory. There were no antibiotics, no antiviral medicine. Vaccination would not be introduced in Europe until the work of Edward Jenner in 1796. Louis XV died at Versailles. Imagine the silence that must have filled those golden halls. All that power, all that spectacle, and yet completely defenseless against something microscopic. Does that shift the way you see royal life? And it was not only smallpox. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, at the time quietly claimed lives across Europe. It spread easily in crowded spaces. Symptoms could linger for years. Coughing, weakness, fever. Versailles was not just a political center. It was a densely populated environment where illness could move from person to person through proximity alone. Even infant mortality tells a sobering story. Royal children, despite the best available physicians, frequently died young. Out of the 6 legitimate children of Louis XIV and Queen Maria Theresa, only one survived into adulthood. In fact, throughout European royal history, losing children was tragically common. We tend to imagine palaces as safe havens, but in reality they were ecosystems. And ecosystems are fragile. What makes this part of the story especially human is the fear. Imagine being surrounded by luxury yet constantly aware that disease could strike at any moment. No germ theory, no microscopes revealing the culprit. Just symptoms, speculation, and hope. Would you feel secure? Or would you feel trapped inside beautiful walls that could not protect you? And here is something that often surprises modern audiences. Medical practices at court could sometimes make things worse. Bloodletting was common. Physicians believed removing blood could rebalance the body's humors. Emetics and purgatives were used to expel supposed toxins. These treatments often weakened patients further. It was not cruelty. It was the best science they had. That is what makes history both humbling and sobering. We like to believe that intelligence always equals safety. But knowledge evolves. What feels advanced in one century can appear dangerously incomplete in the next. There is another layer here too. Versailles was not isolated from the wider world. Diplomats, soldiers, visitors moved in and out. Trade routes connected France to distant regions. Diseases traveled along those same paths. Globalization is not new. It simply moved slower. And yet the psychological impact must have been immense. Court life revolved around appearance, stability, divine right. The king was seen as chosen by God. His health symbolized the health of the nation. So when illness struck the monarch, it was not just a personal crisis. It was political. When Louis XV fell ill, crowds reportedly gathered outside anxious and uncertain. His eventual death did not just mark the end of a life. It marked a shift in confidence. Power suddenly looked fragile. And fragility is contagious. It is fascinating. Is it not how quickly illusions can crack when confronted with biology? We have seen this in our own time. Modern medicine is extraordinary, yet global pandemics still remind us that humanity remains vulnerable. Versailles teaches the same lesson centuries earlier. Silk cannot block infection. Gold leaf cannot repel fever. Perfume cannot neutralize pathogens. Behind every jeweled brooch was a heartbeat that could falter. Behind every royal decree was a body subject to the same rules of nature as everyone else. And when you begin to see Versailles this way, something shifts. It becomes less of a fairy tale and more of a living, breathing community navigating uncertainty. But vulnerability does not stay private for long. When people outside the palace see wealth untouched by their daily struggles, and then hear whispers of excess illness and privilege, resentment can quietly grow. Because while kings battled disease inside gilded chambers, the wider nation was facing its own hardships. And that tension between spectacle and suffering was building, slowly, silently, until one day it would erupt. And that is where we must turn next. From sickness inside the palace to perception outside its gates. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because while illness exposed the fragility of bodies inside Versailles, something else was spreading beyond its gates: perception. And perception can be just as powerful as disease. Step outside the palace for a moment. Leave the hall of mirrors behind. Walk past the fountains. Travel beyond the manicured gardens and into the towns and villages of France in the late 18th century. Bread prices were rising sharply, especially in the 1780s. Poor harvests in 1788 led to severe shortages. For many families, bread made up the majority of daily calories. When the price of bread increased, survival itself became uncertain. Meanwhile, the monarchy was drowning in debt. France had spent enormous sums supporting the American Revolution against Britain. By 1789, the French government was effectively bankrupt. Interest payments consumed a large portion of state revenue. Attempts at tax reform repeatedly failed because the nobility and clergy resisted losing their exemptions. Now imagine how Versailles looked from the outside during this time: a palace of gold, lavish banquets, elaborate ceremonies, thousands of nobles living in decorative excess. Even if daily life inside was uncomfortable in practical ways, from the outside, it appeared dazzling. And appearance was everything. Have you ever scrolled through social media and felt that quiet tension between your own life and the carefully curated images you see? Versailles was the 18th century version of that curated feed. It projected perfection, but outside the palace walls, frustration was building. Pamphlets circulated in Paris criticizing royal spending. Writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment questioned absolute monarchy. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that sovereignty belonged to the people. Rumors flourished. Some were exaggerated, some were unfair, but they spread quickly. One famous example is the phrase often attributed to Queen Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake." There is no reliable evidence that she ever said those words. The line appeared in writings before she even arrived in France. Yet the story stuck. Why? Because it fit the narrative people were ready to believe: that the royal court was detached, indifferent, out of touch. Whether true or not, perception hardened into resentment. Versailles became a symbol, not just of monarchy, but of imbalance. And here is something fascinating. The palace itself was designed to control the nobility. Louis XIV built it to centralize power and prevent rebellion among aristocrats. In that sense, it succeeded, but it also created distance between the monarchy and ordinary citizens. The king was no longer in Paris. He was in a glittering world apart, and distance can be dangerous. When people feel unseen, unheard, and hungry, symbols matter. In October 1789, thousands of market women from Paris marched to Versailles. They were angry about bread shortages. They demanded action. Imagine the scene: rain falling, crowds moving toward the most luxurious palace in Europe. The physical distance between ruler and ruled suddenly collapsed. The royal family was forced to return to Paris. Versailles, once the center of political gravity, was effectively abandoned as a seat of power. All that gold, all that ceremony, and in a matter of days, the illusion of untouchability shattered. Does it surprise you how quickly that happened? For more than a century, Versailles represented strength and permanence. Yet underneath economic strain, political tension, and public frustration had been quietly accumulating. It is tempting to reduce the French Revolution to simple anger at luxury. But the reality was more complex. Financial crisis, structural inequality, Enlightenment ideas, and failed reforms all played crucial roles. Still, Versailles stood as the visual symbol of everything that felt unequal. And symbols are powerful. This is where the story becomes deeply relatable. Because every society, including our own, wrestles with the gap between image and reality, between projection and lived experience. Versailles was not destroyed by bad smell or poor hygiene. It was weakened by the widening distance between its glittering surface and the struggles of the people beyond its gates. The palace that once dazzled Europe became a reminder that no system, no matter how magnificent, is immune to accountability. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson echoing through those empty halls today. Power can build fountains that dance. It can line walls with mirrors. It can choreograph rituals down to the minute. But it cannot permanently mask imbalance. As we move into the final part of this journey, we step back and ask a gentler question. What does Versailles really teach us? Not just about kings and revolutions, but about us, about image, about humanity, about the delicate line between appearance and truth. Let us take one final walk through those corridors, this time with clearer eyes. So now when we picture Versailles, something feels different. The mirrors are still dazzling. The gardens are still symmetrical. The chandeliers still glow like captured sunlight. But we see more than gold. We see the people. And that changes everything. Versailles was not disgusting because its inhabitants were foolish or primitive. It was disgusting by our standards because it belonged to a world that had not yet discovered microbes, antibiotics, or modern plumbing. It was magnificent and limited at the same time. And maybe that is the most honest way to look at history. We often divide the past into heroes and villains, brilliance and ignorance. But Versailles reminds us that reality is rarely that simple. Louis XIV built the palace to control the nobility after the trauma of civil war. And for over a century, it worked. France became the cultural trendsetter of Europe. French fashion, language, and etiquette dominated courts from St. Petersburg to Madrid. Architects across the continent copied Versailles as a blueprint of prestige. That is not failure. That is influence. But influence built on image has a fragile foundation. When the financial crisis deepened in the late 18th century, when bread prices soared after the poor harvest of 1788, when government debt spiraled after years of war, the golden image of Versailles could no longer distract from economic reality. The palace did not cause the French Revolution on its own, but it became the symbol of imbalance. And symbols are powerful. Here is the part that feels strangely modern. Versailles curated perception. It staged daily life. It choreographed access. It polished surfaces. It amplified beauty. It minimized inconvenience from public view. Sound familiar? Today, we do not build palaces of marble and gold leaf. We build digital versions. We post highlights, not hardships. We filter lighting, not reality. Versailles was the ultimate curated profile of the 17th and 18th centuries. Behind the Hall of Mirrors were crowded hallways. Behind powdered wigs were itching scalps. Behind divine right was human vulnerability. And behind the performance of power were people who still feared illness, struggled with uncertainty, and relied on incomplete knowledge. When we strip away the romance, what remains is deeply human. A society doing its best with the science it had. A monarchy trying to maintain control through spectacle. A population reacting to inequality and economic strain. Nothing mythical, nothing magical. Just people navigating power, fear, ambition, and survival. It is easy to laugh gently at chamber pots and powdered wigs. But centuries from now, someone might look back at our era and smile at our own blind spots. History humbles everyone eventually, and perhaps that is why stories like this matter. They remind us that progress is real, that sanitation, medicine, and scientific understanding were hard-won, that comfort is not ancient, it is recent. Versailles still stands today, visited by millions every year. Tourists walk through rooms that once held whispered secrets and political intrigue. They photograph the Hall of Mirrors. They admire the gardens. Few of them imagine the smells, the drafts, the sickness, the tension beneath the shine. But now you do, and somehow knowing the full story does not ruin the magic. It deepens it, because beauty layered over imperfection feels more real than flawless myth. So when you think of Versailles from now on, picture both sides, the glitter and the humanity, the spectacle and the vulnerability. That is where history truly lives. Thank you for walking slowly through these corridors with me tonight. If this story shifted the way you see the past, I would love for you to stay connected for the next journey. There are many more moments in history that look polished on the surface but hide something unexpected underneath. Until our next story, Let the lights stay soft. Let your thoughts wander gently through time. And remember, even the most golden palace was built by very human hands.